Hello, I'm Martha Engber, host of Vigilant Positivity, a blog and podcast meant to decrease polarization by uniting Americans through civil discussion that leads to common ground. Thanks to those of you who tuned in. Please feel free to subscribe and grow the Common Ground movement. This week I'm talking with James Coan, a former finance and data analytics expert who, in 2024, co-founded and is now the executive director of More Like Us, as in US, a national nonprofit aimed at educating Americans about how much common ground we share, despite our political differences. He served as the Washington, D.C. Alliance co-chair and Mid-Atlantic regional lead for Braver Angels, a national nonprofit dedicated to uniting Americans through civil discussion. A few weeks ago, I posted about the first in-person Bridging Movement Summit that took place in late September at Mount Vernon in Virginia, an event organized by the Listen First Project. An attendee, James, wrote an article titled, at the Bridging Movement Summit, Let's Disagree with Each Other About How to Bridge, that was published in Fulcrum. In the piece, he talks about why it's so important to join forces and aim high by uniting 100 million Americans in a common ground movement to kill polarization and shore up our democracy. Hello, James.
Hi, Martha. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Yes, well, thank you so much for joining me. I have so many questions. So let's start with this. Why do you believe, what do you believe is the biggest threat to America at this time in history, and how much time do you think we have to turn things around?
Well, at least I can answer, at least part of the first half of the question. And so I focus a lot on overly negative misperceptions of each other across the political spectrum. So there's quite a bit of work showing that Americans think that those, who may vote differently or identify in the other political party are more ideologically extreme, hostile when just talking one-on-one, threatening in all sorts of ways, inferior, and stereotypical. And when you have that pretty toxic combination of thoughts and feelings, all sorts of things can go haywire, right? I mean, first of all, people generally won't want to talk to each other. And then there are more societal issues that can arise. Well, why should I vote for someone who might collaborate if there's nothing to collaborate on? Maybe I need some kind of, strongman type person to protect myself from those kind of dangerous, threatening people across the political spectrum. So I don't know if this is the most important thing, but it's certainly the topic that I am focused on. And I do not know, how much time we have. It's not my job to predict necessarily. My job is to maximize the likelihood of success and a continued strong country with our system of government.
Well, on your organization's website and in your article, you talk about the need to scale common ground actions in order to get the 100 million Americans to fight back against conflict entrepreneurs. These are politicians, political parties, hostile foreign nations, and big business who are spending billions to purposely divide us for their political gain. You mentioned that there's no way to gain that many people by having one-on-one conversations. And if we somehow arranged 1,000 conversations a day, it would take us 270 years. So how do we scale without that personal interface? And wouldn't it cost money nonprofit bridging organizations don't have?
Yeah, so in terms of a goal, right? So you need to change thoughts and feelings that Americans have about each other across the political spectrum. I don't actually believe that there will be 100 million people fighting for a certain cause. It's more about, right, how we think and feel about each other and having more accurate, thoughts, a greater sense of trust in one another, which will involve a certain number of people taking more proactive steps to achieve that. When it comes to how much would this cost, uh, right, there's a lot of, say, entertainment that's out there, right? There's a lot of sources of messaging, and not all the sources of messaging have to directly come from nonprofits, that it's not necessarily Braver Angels Media's role to reach 100 million people, but it can be a goal for entities in this space to encourage others who do have large platforms to portray those across the political spectrum in a better light.
To act as ambassadors, in other words, for this idea of uniting behind the idea of Americans actually not being mad at one another, but being made to feel that they're mad at one another. Or is that correct?
Yeah, so there are a lot of perverse incentives in today's media environment. Right? If one wants to get clicks, attention, fame, eventually advertising dollars, wealth, uh, it often pays to divide, to portray fellow Americans in really negative ways and portray the country as this very divided binary world where one can only be in one party or another. And when we look at data about the American public is not that divided. This is an overstatement that's often portrayed because, right, if it bleeds, it leads, and right, it can get people very riled up. But it's not really borne out by what people think and feel. And just highlighting, thankfully, the truth about who fellow Americans are, both sometimes through data and also a lot of stories. Uh, there can be ways to push back against this.
What story would you tell that would demonstrate this idea that we are not actually um, mad at one another? We have a lot in common.
Yeah. Well, so there's excellent data. So in terms of what we do at More Like Us, organization I've co-founded and I'm the executive director of, we have something with a group called All Sides called Similarity Hub. We've aggregated about 700 individual survey data points that show overlaps across politics or among supermajorities of Americans. So there is common ground everywhere. It's sometimes portrayed that we need to work really hard to find it. It's just like plentiful, and we can just go out and just share it.
Yeah.
It exists. And then there are organizations such as More in Common that have done a lot of research in this space. There's a finding known as the perception gap, where simply Americans think that those across the political spectrum are more extreme than in reality. And then there's other data points that show people tend to be more civil with each other. They're not as threatening. They do not support political violence. Vast majority of Americans do not. And right, people are complex, and there's a lot of stories that can be told that don't involve, these stereotypical portrayals of who a Democrat is or who a Republican is.
How do you scale getting those messages out, though? There's a lot of if looking at it, if you're, for every 20 negative messages that are out there saying that we are polarized and whatnot, and for good reason, there is, maybe one that shows, hey, that's not really true. So how do you change that ratio?
Yeah, More Like Us, we have decided to focus on college campuses. And there are a lot of benefits of doing this. I mean, one is this is a formative time in people's lives. Another is about the information environment that a college campus has, where it's semi-closed. So putting a bunch of flyers up with these kinds of messages is a way to reach thousands, and on larger campuses, tens of thousands of people all at once. Then there are groups that are trying to do this, outside of the college environment. For instance, there's Bridge Entertainment Labs and a part of Resetting the Table that's trying to work with Hollywood to improve the types of stories that we see in TV and film.
And Hollywood typically is for expanding people's perceptions. Traditionally they have been anyway, and usually doing so in a really entertaining way. So you're saying draw on that expertise in order to make a message about Americans actually getting along more palatable, more entertaining, more something that people want to watch.
Yes. So, in the arts, this is an area of interest to me and to more like us. We have a framework. I really like mnemonics, easy ways to remember ideas, and there's a mnemonic cast. So, recasting fellow Americans in a better and more accurate light. And that's showing uh, Americans as more complex, admirable, similar, and worthy of togetherness, collaboration, friendship, various kinds of relationships than people tend to imagine, which hopefully changes thoughts and feelings relative to the opposites of all those, which is seeing people as stereotypical, inferior, totally different, and worthy of avoidance.
And the recast, I was interested in reading about that. I thought that was interesting. What other aspects is recast I guess, a possible powerhouse for getting the message across?
Yes, I think it provides guidance to those in the arts, right? So it's taking a lot of work in social science. We have a social science advisory council. I try to root myself a lot, typically in social psychology, these kind of us versus them, intergroup dynamics type questions. And then there are people who tend to, be more creative. And it's sort of how do we take this social science knowledge and disseminate it to those who can create all sorts of artistic content that can really speak to people, and in this environment, get people sometimes to click on things.
Well, it's you are part of the Common Ground organization industry, also known as the bridging industry. And so there are a certain amount of challenges within that industry, at least that I have seen. And so, of course, I'm going to invite your comment on that. The first is that there are hundreds of bridging organizations, your org, Braver Angels, and there are hundreds of members per organization, sometimes thousands, yet none has gained national attention, nor have they made serious inroads into educating Americans that there's an option outside of joining one or the other party. In other words, a third option of, hey, let's get together, let's unite. If there are so many organizations, why don't Americans know more about them? And how do we change that?
Yeah, so I would say the organization so far, and this goes back to the first article that you mentioned of mine, the field has focused a great deal on participatory actions. I mean, especially go to this workshop and have a dialogue. Now some, go to this event and maybe we'll plant trees together or something like that. But it takes a lot of time, interest, energy to attend one of these kinds of events. More like us, we focus much more on the information environment. What do we see and hear about each other? The original origin of a lot of this field. So sometimes the terms that are used are contact theory or the contact hypothesis. This comes originally from the 1950s. And the question was, how can people reduce prejudice toward other groups? And so communication is one avenue, but what we see and hear about each other is another. I mean, all of this is just information that we're getting about one another. And we can get information from each other interpersonally. We can get information when we see something, right, on our phones or on TV or on, in terms of a college campus, on a bulletin board, right? All of this is kind of absorbed and it changes how we think and feel about one another.
How do we focus a message, a single message perhaps, that will reach and be a sales pitch for Americans? When I was thinking about this, there is a lot that Americans get currently from being part of one political party or another. For example, they get membership, they get acknowledgement, they get a team to root for, they get a evil opponent to trash talk. So what is that one message, perhaps, that can sell Americans on leaving that negativity behind?
Yeah. So a single message somewhere in the vicinity of we're not as divided as we're told. Right? It's about, to me, primarily thinking about different groups. And what social science tends to show is that group identity is actually really important.
Mhm.
It's a very positive thing in general. And feeling strongly about one's group identity does not necessitate hating another group, right? One can have a strong identity and feel ambivalent or okay with a lot of other groups. And if we look back at data from a few decades ago on this warmth that people feel toward Democrats or Republicans, right? The feelings toward one's own party have remained basically the same for decades. It's really feelings toward the other party that have
Mhm.
diminished, but there's no necessity that, right, just identifying in one party involves, by definition, hating the other. So, I mean, in terms of, the messaging, I think a lot about who are these people across the political spectrum. There's what's sometimes known as horizontal trust.
Mhm.
So building trust, everyday Democrats and Republicans, and that's really what More Like Us focuses on. There's also some vertical trust, so trust in institutions, when
Mhm.
there's some kind of power dynamics and status difference. More Like Us focuses on that less. It's not that it's less important, just right. We have to pick our battles.
Right.
Um, and yeah, so saying, right, they're better than we think, right? Actually they can, what be like Cass, they can be complex and admirable and similar and worthy of togetherness, and like we don't have to fear them as much.
So you're saying that you really do need the videos to go with this, showing people together and talking about one another, like a Republican and Democrat. Hey, we don't hate each other. Those images and the tone of voice are going to be important because, for example, when I tell people, friends and people I know, hey, we have a lot in common, they automatically say, not really. And no, we don't. So, in other words, telling them lacks something that perhaps pictures and video and tone of voice can convey. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, and I think this is a really interesting empirical question, right? Like, because I think this is, so More Like Us, we can think of as more of an air game kind of organization, right? We think a lot about messaging, what we see and hear about each other. A lot of this field is more of a ground game operation. Oh, there's 100 alliances, and we try to
Mhm.
bring as many people to the table. Where they connect for me is that I'm really interested in, okay, if there's someone in alliance, can they go run around to their neighborhood and spread information in their networks? For me, like, these people across the political spectrum are actually better than we think. And what messages are needed when people spread that message? For some, it could be like, oh, there's Similarity Hub, and here's 700 examples of common ground. And some people might be like, wow, okay, well, I'll look at it, and that's convincing to me. Other people will be like, no, that's just a bunch of numbers, right? I need to connect with stories, and then verbalizing stories and showing stories, right? It's all information, so it's just kind of packaging it in different ways.
That's very interesting. So you're saying that really, in order to fight the negative messaging that is occurring now, and it's deep and it's long and it's moneyed, effort. It really needs to be fight fire fight with fire. So media, focusing everything on media and on these not only one story, but lots of different stories to reach different people, different ethnicities, different ages, different cultures. Is that correct?
Yes, and going back to the cast framework, I think many of these stories will show people across the political spectrum or who might vote in the other for the other party, right, as more complex, right, as more admirable, as more similar, and therefore often we can work with them together.
Mhm.
we can be friends with them. So yes, I think those are powerful, and messages have to be targeted more for various audiences, right? There's not like one message, one story that will resonate with 340 million people.
Well, if you had to calculate, give people an idea about how much this needs to be scaled up, is there a way to do that? For example, okay, yeah, there are currently, 100 negative messages and we've got one positive message, or something of that nature to give people an idea of how currently out of balance it feels.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. So, okay, first of all, I will say what More Like Us does, right? We are trying to add positive messages. I also think there needs to be a lot of work on what I would call reversing perverse incentives, right? Right. There's so many incentives to produce media that divides us. And right, so right, I think both sides need to be worked on. I don't know if I have a great data point about, unifying versus dividing messages. I will say that as you call it, the common ground movement, maybe I would call it like a movement that's trying to move in the direction of trust or whatever it is. The focus has been so much on we need to have conversations that there hasn't necessarily been a strong effort on saying we are actually more united than we think. That hasn't It's kind of
Mhm.
been a message, but not really. It's sort of like, well, you can talk to people, but you could talk to all sorts of people. So, I mean, we don't even have like a clear side that is pushing a message against things that would be more divisive. I will say that uh, a relatively small number of people can have outsized influence. So there's some work about social media. And so Jay Van Bavel at NYU has done some of this data work on, 6 to 7% of Americans account for like 75% of political posts. Sometimes in terms of, if again it's a mis and disinformation type work, sometimes like the 0.1% of spreaders account for a very substantial share. So there's often the sense of, oh, people online get so angry and they're so terrible with each other. Well, it tends to be a relatively small share of Americans who do that kind of stuff, but because they get a platform and then the algorithms, encourage it farther, we have to say, oh, people are like this. Well, it's not actually all people like this. Most people don't do anything political online, but we get a sense that like, oh, it's so toxic and awful, uh, just because a small share of people tend to kind of have an outsized voice on platforms.
Well, I assume that those people are, first of all, that's their business. They're being paid for it, probably. Um, uh, well, feel free to, disagree with that. But they're certainly very organized. And uh, so are you saying that we more or less need to get common Americans, so a broader swath of common Americans to engage this way, to make these types of posts, to counter these people with outsized influence? What do you think?
Yeah, so there are some people who do this for money. I mean, the algorithms encourage this kind of work. There's also people who, have ideologically bought into this, and right, they're at home and they like to share political content, and that happens to be divisive. Um, so we have this three ends framework for what people can do. So, which is usually about spreading messages, but in their neighborhoods, networks, and for a few people, the entire nation. And so, right, I mean, I think a lot of the work of many of the organizations in the space that have more of a ground game focus is to activate people to have this outward focus, maybe even use terms like, almost like evangelizing to get out
Mhm.
there and say, yeah, actually, right, we're not as divided as we're told. There's actually lots of goodness in people across the political spectrum. And this can be in neighborhoods, just like talking to a next door neighbor. But yeah, then when we get into networks, some of this is social media, but it can also be any other networks that people have, their religious community, maybe in their job, what can their CEO say about politics that actually is helpful? And that kind of work, activating all sorts of megaphones that are in people's lives.
Is there a place where people could go say that they're interested and inspired by our conversation today? And they're like, I'd be really happy to share a post where I'm next to I'm a Democrat and I'm with my friend, a Republican. And we're going to show people that we're not mad at each other. And we're going to, share a little video about that. But they need a little encouragement, a template, for example, a website to go to where they can follow instructions about how to do this. Is there anything at this time that would allow for that?
Sort of. I mean, the people would have to be relatively enterprising because we focus on college students since it tends to be more structured. But on our website, we do have some guidance for creatives, and people can follow this cast framework and right, especially togetherness, show examples of friendship. We can go back to what I used to do before the pandemic. There was something I started called Red Blue Together, which is still on Instagram, and shares stories of friends and those in close relationships across the political spectrum, and that could inspire people. There was a work, the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, run by Stanford, and one of the best performing interventions was a campaign ad. The current governor of Utah, Spencer Cox, and his Democratic opponent, and that has turned into Disagree Better, which has created some kind of videos. And in theory, someone could emulate that, or could take just these videos that did well in the competition or have already been made from Disagree Better and simply share it, or share any other aspect of our website that you think is of interest.
Okay, so I'll definitely be, of course, including links to your programs, and I think that's great. As just a common person who is kind of moving through this, I'm like, wow, I just want a website that's easy 1, 2, 3. And so, if you do hear about anything, do let me know. Now, I wanted to move on to the Bridging Summit when it took place. Is I was really ecstatic to hear about it. I really was. Because that's what I wanted to see is bridging organizations come together under the umbrella of, and again, I'm using the term common ground movement because I haven't heard anything that's better. And is it all right to tell you what I, as American, would like to see accomplished under under that umbrella?
Absolutely, and you're the host, so go ahead.
You have to. Well, I was interested in a kind of a common ground pledge that is a simple, clear statement of purpose across these bridging organizations. Creation of a short list of common ground issues that most Americans can rally behind. Not, for example, the 200 are more than 200 are listed on Voice of the People for people who are listening to this. So you are correct that there's a lot of evidence about common ground issues. 3, the development of a slate of common ground political candidates who are willing to work together. 4, the implementation of clear targeted messaging, which is exactly what you're talking about, to offer Americans. Like I would like your message to be agreed upon, perhaps, across the organizations. And the creation of an easy way for Americans to get involved in local, state, national level. My question is, do you think bridging organizations have the will to unite and create such a platform of action and shared expertise?
Well, so there's willpower. Thanks for sharing the ideas, and dig into them as much as you'd like. I'd probably have to write them down and note all of them. But right, the article that I wrote was maybe the willpower or courage to be open to disagreeing about what to do. So what might be surprising is that, right, this is a field about, say, bridging, uh, but it has not internally bridged very much. There's generally been kind of this kind of, I don't know, tacit consensus that, right, like interpersonal dialogue and maybe some activities together is the answer. And I think after listening to me, you'll see that I'm relatively skeptical about the arithmetic of that approach. But that hasn't necessarily gotten right, right. Like this has to be brought up to get this sort of on the agenda that, hey, maybe we need to reassess our approaches, right? It's right, coming up on a decade, and are we really where we want to be? Are the strategies that are being you know are being used, are they the optimal ones? Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know, right? So there's often this thing of, oh, can we come together? But I would say that the field has sort of come together too much,
Hmm.
right? It's sort of like if you have too much consensus, right? Sometimes need to like say, well, wait, let's actually evaluate what we're doing and change our approach. Then maybe there could be come together more. But even then, I don't know if there would be, perfect alignment. I think more like us will tend to be more of an air game organization. There will be organizations that tend to be more ground game. I will try to, encourage ground game organizations to be as useful as possible from my standpoint, but they will probably have messages that they would want spread that I may or may not agree with, right? I mean, I think that's okay to have some degree of lack of alignment. I don't know. I'm almost thinking of there was a movie uh, so right before the March on Washington, right? All the major civil rights organizations getting together, and right, I mean, eventually, yes, they all decided to do this, but like it wasn't like they all agreed on every single point. I mean, it was a tough kind of process, and I think there'll always be that kind of some degree of tension. I actually think that that's kind of good rather than just being like we're doing everything right.
I think that's really interesting because I think we're talking about the same thing, but coming at it from different angles. And so what I'm thinking of is because I think perhaps what you say is correct, that it is focused on interpersonal interactions largely. And therefore, the notion of messaging or the degree to which it's emphasized is not been perhaps as present as it should be. But if there were a summit in which it was like creating a company, for example, and you need your marketing department, you need your advertising department, you need your people who are in charge of strategy and so forth, and the bridging industry came together in that respect, to pull in the expertise of each organization to get all the ground covered, whether that would be something that's possible.
I don't know because right, it depends on what the mindsets are to begin with,
Mm.
right? If there is an idea that like uh right, so I mean sometimes there's statements that might are sort of right but can be misleading, like trust moves at the speed of relationships. Well, if we're talking about really deep levels of trust, that's probably true. But when you're talking about intergroup dynamics, sometimes you don't need that incredible depth of trust, and you just want to be, sort of go in that direction and reduce elements that are counter to trust. And so, right, like I mean, I'm more in this precursor stage to that to just say, let's be open to discuss these different assumptions and mindsets that we have that yeah maybe it will have some kind of consensus and congeal at some point, but it's also possible that right there could be some differences, but at least we'll kind of express them and hopefully articulate things honestly about why we're saying why we're pursuing certain goals rather than just being like, well, that's kind of what we've done, and right, we can kind of right, there's sometimes like glossy kind of rhetoric, right? Like
Mhm.
very, trying to be really uplifting, but okay, I mean, and see, kind of peel back the rhetoric, what is the strategy there and how are those strategies likely to succeed at scale in such a large country?
Mm. Well, I would say that very little would ever happen, I think, with anything, unless there is broad scale messaging and media. That's the way our world operates. So, unless that happens, then the common ground movement will
Well, thank you. No,
languish.
no, I agree.
Well, tell me what your takeaways from the summit were then. And
Yeah. Well, yeah, so with most uh, uh, conferences, I tend to get the most out of, right, the interactions with individuals there, right? So deepen relationships, meet new people, and I go to conferences all the time. I mean, I live in DC, and that was one of 5 conferences that I attended in the month of September. Right, so it's just right
Oh,
going and meeting lots of people. Um, I think there were a number of interesting uh, items mentioned. There's a program called NormZ
oh,
that tries to uh, challenge when there's problematic rhetoric on X. This suggests responses in the comments section, and there's an interest in possibly having a bot do this and automating it, and then that could scale. And there's some research and some messaging that was discussed, although sort of under wraps at this point. And there were a couple social psychologists who I think had a really good kind of uh, framework. There was something kind of funny that a goal can sometimes be getting to meh, which right is not going to be the top message that should reach 100 million people. But in terms of thinking what the goal is, like level of trust and having these super warm feelings across the political spectrum. Sometimes they can work, but many times that's a little too much. But like getting toward ambivalence and like tolerance and right these kind of like
yes.
lukewarm areas is
Mhm.
actually much better than what a lot of people feel, and that can be a reasonable goal. And I think that's cool. But in line with my article, I would have liked to see more grappling with what should be done. There was, uh, in some cases, rightly positive, uh, you know, presentation of what is happening. Um, but I think there's also a lot more that has to be discussed that sometimes wasn't as prominent on the schedule.
Mm. Well, I had one last question here, and what can you say to those of us who are convinced, like you, that we have a lot in common and we would be able to solve a lot of problems if we unite behind this idea that we are um, have more in common than not. Um, but what's one thing we can do today to help?
Mm. Well, I mean, the most self-serving answer as an organization focused on colleges is if you have a contact at a college that wants to improve its civil discourse programming and help students realize that we have more common ground, please reach out to me and I'd love to talk. Um, but I can answer this question more broadly if you would like.
Sure.
No, I mean, right. So thinking about spreading this message, right? We're not as divided uh, as um, as we're told, as people tend to think, um, and finding creative ways to spread that message, which can sometimes be as simple as saying it, right? Like, hey, and referring to you talked about Voice of the People. Our site that we do with all sides is called Similarity Hub, similarityhub.org, right? Where there's just a lot of data that shows that there is actually uh, common ground. Um, but then, yeah, people can feel free to reach out to me and see if there are some opportunities to get involved in a more structured way.
That's wonderful. I really like the idea of the get to the point where you're ambivalent. So if somebody says, "Hey, those other people are rotten," you're able to say, "Well, I think so."
Well, yes, and well, that's an entirely different topic about mis and disinformation, right?
But
That if someone has a message that's like they're terrible and you're like, no, they're not, then right, that piece of information can essentially bounce off. And so, right, there are a lot of,
yes.
I think, a lot of benefits to that kind of state.
Well, thank you so much. We could go on for like another hour easy. It's a big, deep topic, and I'm fascinated by it. And thanks to all of those of you who have listened to this episode. You can find a post of the transcript on my blog and today's interview on the YouTube channel. I am on vigilantpositivity.wordpress.com, and please join our cause. And thank you so much, James, for talking with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Martha.